Thank you, choir. So you've probably already heard this a lot in the past week, but I'll bet you have not heard it from a guy standing in a pulpit. Happy New Year. Thank you. Because the calendar is flipped over, this is the time a lot of us focus on making resolutions, right? Lose weight, save money, spend more time with the people who matter to us, learn a new skill, do that thing we've been putting off, finally write the great American novel we all know we have inside. Resolutions are great, but we also have a pesky habit of failing to keep them. That initial flame on our candle of commitment can blow out pretty quickly because real life gets in the way. All of our normal obligations and habits, they don't pay attention to the new year. That stuff we do just to make it from one day to the next keeps chugging right along like the calendar doesn't even exist. So how do we keep resolutions? Well, first, I think it's important to step back and ask a bigger and more basic question. Why do we keep resolutions? Why do we ever want to make any resolution? If your resolution is to lose some weight, get healthier, eat less junk food, then the why of that really could be many things. It could be that you want to look better to yourself or feel better or even manage a chronic health issue. But those are not so much the answer to why, those are the benefits. The why, if anything, goes deeper than that. The why always gets back to the essentials of who we are and who we want to be, what we're seeking. The why can be thought of as our guiding star. Now, I love the story of the three wise men. Like all the stories surrounding the birth of Christ, we have heard it so often, I think it can suffer from our familiarity with it. So let's think it through as if we're hearing it for the first time and considering what it might mean. Now, we don't know for sure who these men from the East were. They're never named in the Bible, although the church in its tradition came up with names for them. And we actually don't know if there were three of them. We just assume there were three because three gifts were named, as if only one carry-on bag per person is allowed on this trip to welcome a new king. And when we say the wise men, most of us also picture kings or some kind of royalty. Although that may be how the famous Christmas carol goes. The truth is, no kings are strictly speaking mentioned in the Bible either. That assumption comes from the idea that only someone very wealthy could afford those pricey gifts and had the luxury of taking time off to follow a star. Or maybe it's because only kings would be given an audience with King Herod, kind of a professional courtesy. All we really know about them, according to Matthew, is that they were wise men from the East, which in those days meant a couple of significant things in the impact that that news had on the original hearers of Matthew's gospel. The first thing that would have struck people is that these wise men were not Jews. They were almost certainly Persians. And back then, when you said someone was from the East, it was understood you were probably referring to Persia. They're also the first non-Jews even mentioned in Matthew. The Jews were familiar enough with Persians. About 600 years before this story takes place, their ancestors who had been held in captivity in Babylon, they were allowed to return home after the Persians had liberated them, after the Persians had defeated the Babylonian Empire. King Cyrus the Great of Persia had done that good deed, and the prophet Isaiah had even written about it. Persians were mostly followers of an ancient religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism. Try to put that on your church sign as people. There's so many practitioners of it today, but it had great influence on Judaism and Christianity, including the belief in one supreme God and practicing good ethics like helping the less fortunate. Also, a Messiah-like figure who would be born of a virgin, he would be able to raise the dead, and he would preside over the righteous and the unrighteous at the last judgment. That sounds a little familiar. And Persians also studied astronomy. In those days, the distinction could be pretty thin between astronomy, the scientific discipline of studying the cosmos, and astrology, looking to the sky as a way of understanding human destiny, seeing signs in the stars. And the knowledge of those things was limited to the few people who had the time and the resources to become experts, so they were assumed to be wise. Now, the people who wrote the Bible, including Matthew and the later editors of his gospel, they didn't have the benefit of our modern scientific understanding of the universe. Even if they had, they were not attempting to write a scientific account in the first place. And I'm really flabbergasted. Every year around Christmas time, and I saw it this year too, I'll be standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, and like clockwork in that season, a magazine will appear in the sales rack proclaiming that astronomers believe they have finally discovered the star that guided the wise men in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. I guess it sells magazines. But really? Matthew and the other gospel writers, they were telling a faith story, not a story that can be proven by the scientific method. And weaving into that story, the extraordinary supernatural things like stars appearing and rising and stopping. That was a common aspect in mythologies shared by ancient cultures, that the appearance of a star or other unusual celestial activity meant that a king had been born. And everyone, of course, is born under the sign of one star or another, but a king gets his own very unique star. So according to the story, the wise men, off in their eastern land, probably Persia, could not help but notice this remarkable phenomenon. They inferred from this that a new king had arrived, and they set out to pay homage, to follow the star. Now, one of the things I love about this story is how it starts, with the wise men showing up at the palace of King Herod the Great. Herod was the ruler of Judea, which at the time was a province of the Roman Empire. Herod was nominally a Jew, but he was only a king in that he was a local ruler of a piece of Roman territory, and he was great at doing that. He was a fantastic politician, and he was infamous for being not only a great builder of public works, but for being a rather vicious guy. He was known for murdering his own close family members to maintain his power. And some wise men arriving unannounced to honor a new king, they would have definitely gotten his attention. In any event, it would have only been natural for the wise men to assume that a new king would be born into the family of the current king. But of course, that wasn't the case. Luke tells us that Jesus wasn't born in a palace at all, but in a barn. And I think we've lost this sense in the story today, but Matthew tells it in such a way that is filled with irony and humor. We are meant to chuckle at this story. The wise men come in and say, "We're here to worship the new king." What new king? There's no new king. I'm the king. Oh, well, never mind. That would just be an awkward conversation, especially with a guy like Herod. But it points out something important, that our preconceived notions can lead us away from the path of the star that we ought to be following. The story says the wise men only followed the star so far. They then went to Jerusalem because their false assumptions took over. Of course, the new king is going to be here, they said to themselves, where the king lives, at a palace in Jerusalem, the fanciest place in town. So where's his room? We brought some really nice gifts. It's only after they realize their mistake and step back outside and apparently look up do they understand that they lost track of the star that had been guiding them. Here we go, this way. Getting off track is easy enough to do if we don't occasionally stop and ask ourselves the big question of why. Asking why we do anything forces us to get to the core of what matters most, who matters most, what our guiding principles are, what's at stake. Now, if you have ever failed in a New Year's resolution, and I've failed at plenty, it's probably because the answers to those questions were not very well defined. One year, many years ago, I resolved I was going to relearn how to play the piano. I took piano lessons as a child, got to a certain point where I could plunk out really basic songs. But then as I got older, I got into other musical instruments. I joined the orchestra and the band at school and ignored playing the piano. And the years went by to the point that if I ever really wanted to play piano, I'd have to start all over again, almost from scratch. And as an adult, I had a sense of deep regret about that I'd ever let piano drop out of my life. So that new year, I went out and spent way too much money on a brand new electric keyboard. It was nice. Lots of bells and whistles. I bought a bunch of music, video tutorials. I resolved to relearn the piano and maybe launch a side career as a lounge singer with a nice big hip jar. You can picture that, right? But you can guess what happened. That big keyboard, it became just another piece of horizontal furniture in my apartment. And it was pretty handy for stacking magazines and junk mail on top of. I just never could quite find the time to practice. There was always something more important to do, and it was really hard to watch basketball games and practice the piano at the same time. I tried, but no. So I sold the keyboard and I felt like a failure. I did not have what it took. I lacked commitment. I was weak. But looking back, I now realize that I was, and I am, none of those things. I'm not a complete failure in other areas of my life. I do what it takes in some ways, and I have a ton of commitment when it comes to people and causes that I care about. So why was I such a flop when it came to relearning the piano? Because I could not answer why. I'm not even sure I bothered to ask myself why. Having some vague fantasy about being a lounge singer, I realized that was not anything that got to the core of who I am or why I exist in the first place. It was a fun fantasy to have, but that's all it was because it wasn't well defined. It didn't cause me really to take any risks. It didn't revolve around what really matters most to me. So the thing I learned about resolutions is to make sure that I have those questions answered before I resolve to do anything. I need to know my guiding star. Now, for the wise men, the why was they needed to worship and pay homage and bring gifts of thanksgiving to a newborn king. That was just the kind of people they were. In ancient mythology, these were characters who understood the significance of things that average people might not ever see. So they served the purpose in the story of pointing out important things for the rest of us. That was their reason for being, their life's work. It's really what made them wise. But even if they got off track temporarily, when they lost sight of their guiding star, happens to lots of people. So that begs the question, what's your guiding star? What's your why? What's at the core of who you are? Joseph Campbell was an expert in mythology and religion, came to prominence back in the early 70s. One of his most famous quotes or pieces of advice was also a nice pithy saying, follow your bliss. You remember that? Follow your bliss can sound trite and even self-serving, but Joseph Campbell wasn't suggesting that. The entire quote is, follow your bliss and the universe will open doors where there were only walls. Bliss is what makes you happy and what brings you joy, but there's another way to think about it, a deeper way. When you were a child and you had your whole life ahead of you and you didn't yet have anyone telling you things like that's impossible or you can't do that or you're not smart enough or you're not talented enough or you're not good enough. And you imagine the best life would look like for you. Think back to that flutter in your heart and that warm feeling of contentment, that joy and that rush of adrenaline. Find that feeling again, and that is bliss. And I don't think that is selfish at all, because bliss doesn't mean that we won't need to work hard. It doesn't mean that things will come easily. It doesn't mean we ever stop learning. It doesn't mean there will be no self-sacrifice. It doesn't mean whatever our bliss might be, that living into it won't require courage and persistence in taking risks. And most importantly, it does not mean that our bliss will be kept to ourselves. Because we know as children and we know as grown-ups that our greatest bliss is found in sharing who we are and what we have. Our bliss is not in receiving, it's in giving. Joseph Campbell also said, a hero is someone who has given his or her life to something bigger than oneself. That's bliss. Because that is how we are wired, how we're created, how God made us. It's why the wise men brought gifts and they worshiped. It's why we bring the gift of who we are to this place, this community of love, to help it grow, to give ourselves to something bigger than ourselves. Follow the bliss at the core of our being. Follow the why. Follow that star that God has invested in our lives. And our resolutions will come true. Amen.